The summer of 1887 arrived in the New Mexico territory not as a season but as a sentence, slow, merciless, and impossible to appeal. By July, the land had surrendered every last drop of green, and what remained was a world bleached to the color of old teeth. The sky stretched overhead like a sheet of hammered tin, white at the edges where the heat pressed against the horizon, and the sun did not shine so much as it bore down, a fist of light grinding the earth into silence. There were no clouds. There had not been clouds for 41 days. The riverbeds had cracked into patterns that resembled the palms of ancient hands, and the sagebrush stood brittle and silver along the flats, trembling in a wind that carried no relief, only the dry perfume of dust, iron, and something older than both. Far to the south, a pair of vultures turned in wide, unhurried circles, their patience a kind of faith. This was country that did not forgive. It did not remember. It simply endured, and it expected the same of anything foolish enough to cross it. Graves had been crossing it for 3 days. He rode a sun-faded buckskin mare whose ribs were beginning to show beneath her coat, and he sat the saddle the way a man sits a church pew when he has stopped believing, but has nowhere else to go, still, heavy, eyes forward. His hat threw a band of shadow across a face that had been carved by wind and trouble in equal measure. His knuckles were. His jaw was rough with a week's worth of stubble the color of rust. He carried a rifle in a scabbard and a revolver on his hip, but neither had been fired in months, and there was something in the way he held the reins loose, almost careless, that suggested a man who had grown tired of being ready for what came next. He was not running from anything, not anymore. The bounty on his name had expired 2 territories back, and the gang he once rode with had scattered like seeds thrown on stone. What remained of Graves was a reputation he never corrected, and a quietness that people in small towns mistook for menace. He let them. It was easier than explaining that silence, for him, was not a threat. It was simply what was left after you stripped away everything you once thought you were. The mare stopped before he saw her. She planted her hooves and refused to move, ears pitched forward, nostrils flaring at something the wind had carried. Trusted the animal more than he trusted most men. He followed her gaze across the flat, squinting against the glare, and at first he saw nothing but the usual cruelty of the landscape: sand, rock, the shimmer of heat bending the air into shapes that were not there. Then his eyes caught it. A shape too soft for stone. A form too still for living but too whole for dead. He dismounted slowly. His boots hit the ground with a sound like dry paper tearing. He walked 30 paces, then 20 more, and the shape became a body, a woman, face down in the sand, her dress torn along the back and bleached almost colorless by the sun. Her boots were gone. Her feet were blistered raw. Her hair, dark and matted, was spread around her head like a stain. He knelt beside her, pressed 2 fingers to her throat and waited. Nothing. He adjusted, tried again. And there, faint as a moth's wing against glass, a pulse. One hand twitched at her side, fingers curling into the sand and releasing, curling and releasing, as though she were trying to hold on to something the earth kept taking back. He turned her gently. Her face was swollen and sun-cracked, her lips split white, and her eyes were closed in a way that looked less like sleep and more like surrender. Across her shoulders and upper back, visible through the torn fabric, ran the faded welts of a whip, not fresh but not old either. Someone had done this with patience. Someone had done this more than once. Pulled his canteen, tipped water against her lips, just a thread of it, the way you feed a flame you are not sure wants to keep burning. She swallowed once, twice. Her eyelids trembled but did not open. He was reaching for his coat to cover her when her arm shifted, and the sleeve of her dress fell back from her wrist. He stopped. His breath stopped. Everything in the wide, indifferent desert stopped. There, burned into the pale skin of her inner wrist, was a brand. Not a scar from accident or labor. A deliberate mark, a crooked letter H enclosed within a circle, the edges raised and puckered, the kind of wound that had been inflicted with a heated iron and held long enough to mean something. It was a cattle brand. He had seen it on fence posts and horse flanks and stamped into the leather of saddles from here to the. It was the mark of Judge Solomon, the most powerful rancher in the territory, a man who owned land, law, and the silence of everyone too afraid to speak his name aloud. But this was not a horse. This was not a fence post. This was a woman, and someone had pressed that iron into her skin the way you press a seal into wax to declare ownership, to make sure that whoever found her would know exactly who she had tried to escape and exactly where to return her. Sat back on his heels, he looked at the brand for a long time. The desert wind moved across them both and said nothing. He thought of the nearest town, Flats, and dismissed it before the thought fully formed. Flats was territory. Every deputy, every shopkeeper, every pair of eyes in that town reported to the judge. Bringing her there would not be rescue. It would be delivery. He looked south. 2 days of hard riding, maybe more with a woman half dead across his saddle. But south was Sable Creek, a town too poor and too stubborn to owe anything. A town with a doctor who still remembered what his hands were for when they were not wrapped around a bottle. Removed his coat and draped it across her body. He lifted her with a care that surprised even him, one arm beneath her knees, the other supporting her shoulders, and carried her to the mare. She weighed almost nothing. That was the thing that undid him, though he would never have said so. Not the brand, not the welts, but the lightness of her, as though the world had already taken everything it could carry, and what remained was barely enough to call a life. He mounted with her cradled against his chest, turned the mare south, and rode into the falling dusk. Behind them, the sand erased every trace of where she had lain, as though the desert itself had decided that this was not where her story would end. Somewhere ahead, the first pale star appeared above the, small and stubborn and burning against all that darkness. He fixed his eyes on it and did not look back. They rode through 2 nights and the long, punishing corridor of daylight that stretched between them. The desert at noon was a furnace with no walls, but the desert after sundown was something else entirely. A cathedral of cold and silence where the stars appeared so close and so numerous that they seemed less like distant suns and more like puncture wounds in a fabric barely holding back some greater, hidden light. Kept the mare at a steady walk, one arm locked around the woman who drifted in and out of consciousness against his chest, her breathing shallow and irregular. Each exhale a small negotiation between the body's will to continue and the spirit's exhaustion with the cost of doing so. Twice she woke, and both times her eyes opened with a terror so immediate and so complete that it was clear she did not know where she was or who held her. She flinched from his hands as though every touch she had ever known had ended in pain. He did not speak. He did not tighten his grip. He simply held the reins steady and let the silence between them say what words could not, that he was not the thing she feared, and that the road ahead, though long, was leading somewhere other than back. On the second evening, just as the sky bruised into shades of copper and violet along the western ridge, Sable Creek rose out of the flatland like a half-remembered thought. It was not much of a town. A single street of packed dirt ran between a scattering of false-fronted buildings whose paint had long since surrendered to the weather. There was a saloon with a crooked sign that read the Copper Veil, a general store with dusty windows, a livery stable, and a small church at the far end whose steeple carried no bell, as though the town had decided long ago that there was nothing worth announcing. The light from oil lamps bled gold through doorways and across the street in uneven patches, and the air smelled of horse sweat, wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of something baking in a kitchen nearby. People stopped what they were doing and watched. A man like Graves, armed, sun-blackened, riding slow into town with an unconscious woman draped across his saddle, was not a comfort. It was a question, and Sable Creek was a town that had learned to survive by not asking too many of those. Eyes followed him from porches and windows. A woman pulled her child inside. 2 men standing outside the livery exchanged a glance that carried the full weight of suspicion without requiring a single word. Rode directly to a cabin set back from the street, where a lamp burned low behind a curtain the color of tobacco stain. He dismounted and knocked once, hard. The man who opened the door was tall and gaunt, with a face that looked as though it had been assembled from spare parts left over after God finished the more carefully constructed models. His eyes were bloodshot but sharp, and his hands, long-fingered, elegant, trembling faintly at the tips, were the hands of a surgeon who had not operated sober in some time. Doc looked then at the woman in his arms and stepped aside without asking a single question. Some things did not require explanation. Some things simply required a clean table and steady light. Doc worked through the night, sat on the porch with his rifle balanced across his knees and his back against the wall, listening to the small sounds from inside, the clink of instruments in a porcelain basin, the low murmur of Doc talking to himself the way men do when they are trying to keep their hands from shaking. When Doc finally emerged near dawn, his sleeves rolled to the elbows and his face gray with exhaustion, he sat down beside and said nothing for a long while. Then he spoke in a voice as dry and careful as old paper. Dehydration, sunstroke, 2 cracked ribs, lash marks across the back in various stages of healing suggesting repeated abuse over a period of weeks or longer, bruising around both wrists consistent with restraints, and the brand. Doc paused at the brand. He looked at with eyes that had seen enough suffering to fill several lifetimes, and in that look was a question he did not ask and an answer did not give. They both knew the mark. They both knew what it meant. She woke on the 3rd morning. Heard it from the porch, not a scream, but a sharp intake of breath followed by the frantic rustle of someone trying to understand where they were and whether they needed to run. He did not go inside. He stayed where he was and listened as Doc's voice, low and unhurried, walked her back from the edge of panic. Minutes passed, then stillness. Then a sound he had not expected, a woman's voice, raw and fractured, asking for water. He filled a cup from the barrel beside the cabin and brought it to the doorway but did not cross the threshold. He set the cup on the floor where she could see it and stepped back. She was sitting up in the cot, the blanket pulled to her collarbone, her dark eyes watching him with the fixed intensity of an animal determining whether to fight or flee. Her left hand gripped the edge of the blanket. Her right hand was hidden beneath it, pressing the branded wrist against her body, concealing it, as though the mark were not a wound but a confession she could not bear to make. He did not look at her wrist. He looked at her eyes, and then he looked away, and then he left. Over the following days he brought broth and bread, and once a bundle of wildflowers he had found growing stubborn and purple along the creek bed. He left everything by the door. He never entered unless invited, and he was never invited. This restraint cost him nothing and meant everything, though neither of them could have explained why. It was simply the first language they shared, this grammar of distance and care, of leaving things within reach without demanding they be taken. On the 5th day, Dalton at the general store told the preacher's wife, who told the farrier's daughter, who told anyone willing to lean against a fence post and listen, that the outlaw Graves had brought a branded woman into town and was keeping her at Doc's cabin like a dog guarding a bone. By sundown the whole town was whispering, and the whispers were not kind. They never are, in places where people have so little that the suffering of a stranger becomes a kind of currency, something to trade, to hoard, to spend in the economy of judgment. It was Nell who broke the current. She walked into Doc's cabin without knocking, took one look at Rose's wrist and said nothing about it. Instead, she pulled a chair to the bedside, sat down, and asked the only question that mattered. "Can you work?" Rose looked at her for a long time. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, a voice that sounded as though it had been locked inside a dark room and was only now remembering the shape of open air, she spoke her name. Just her first name. Rose. She said it the way someone sets down a stone they have been carrying for miles, unsure whether the ground beneath it will hold. Section 3. The Brand and the Burning. Rose did not tell her story the way rivers tell theirs, in one long, unbroken rush toward the sea. She told it the way the desert gives up rain, in sudden, scattered bursts that came without warning and vanished just as quickly, leaving the ground darker than before. A sentence while scrubbing glasses behind Nell's bar. a murmur during a nightmare that Doc overheard through the thin cabin walls and never mentioned. A confession spoken so quietly into the evening air from the saloon's upstairs balcony that it seemed addressed not to any living person, but to the first stars appearing above the ridge, as though she trusted them more than she trusted the earth below. She had been a schoolteacher in East Texas. That detail always came first, offered like a credential, proof that she had once been something whole and recognizable and worth respecting. She had taught children their letters in a one-room schoolhouse with a leaking roof, and she had been good at it, patient in the way that only people who understand the weight of ignorance can be patient, gentle in the way that only people who were never shown gentleness learn to become. When the advertisement appeared in the territorial newspaper, a wealthy rancher in New Mexico seeking a governess for his 3 children, passage paid, room and board provided, it had seemed like an answered prayer. She had written back the same day. She had packed her single trunk. She had boarded the stage west with her heart full of the kind of hope that belongs exclusively to people who have not yet learned what hope costs in country like this. There were no children. Judge Solomon's ranch house was a sprawling stone edifice set against the foothills like a monument to appetite. There were cattle and horses and miles of fenced land, but no children, no wife, no family of any kind, only hired men with quiet eyes and a silence that hung over the property like smoke from a fire no one would acknowledge. Rose understood within the first hour that she had not been hired. She had been acquired. When she asked to leave, explained in a voice as calm and measured as a clock that her passage had cost money, that the room she occupied cost money, that the food she consumed cost money, and that until these debts were settled she would remain. He said this while sitting behind a desk made of imported mahogany, surrounded by the mounted heads of animals he had killed, and he smiled the way a man smiles when he knows that the law, the distance, and the landscape itself are all on his side. She tried to leave twice. The first time, one of his men caught her before she reached the property line and brought her back across the saddle of his horse like a sack of grain. Did not raise his voice. He simply took her right hand, turned it palm up, and pressed the branding iron already heated, already waiting, as though he had known she would run before she knew it herself into the soft skin of her inner wrist. She remembered the smell more than the pain, the smell of her own burning. He held the iron for a count of 5, and when he pulled it away, the crooked H inside its circle stared up at her like a new eye that would never close. He told her that every rancher, every lawman, every soul between thee and the would recognize that mark and know exactly where she belonged, and to whom she must be returned. The second time she ran, his men did not bring her back. They rode her out into the desert, stripped her boots, cut the laces of her dress, and left her in the sand the way you leave a thing whose usefulness has ended. Not punishment, disposal. She was not worth the iron it would take to brand her again. Rose told this last part only once to Nell, in the kitchen behind the saloon, while flour dust hung in the afternoon light like a congregation of small ghosts. She told it without tears, which was somehow worse. Nell listened with her arms folded and her jaw set and said only this: "You're here now, and here is mine." The story reached in pieces, too, through Doc, through Virgil, who arrived in Sable Creek a week later with dust in his collar and worry in his eyes, and through the silences Rose left behind her like footprints. Virgil was the only man alive who knew the full architecture of his past, and over a fire outside town he laid it out plainly. Years ago had ridden with a crew that robbed one of supply trains, clean job, no one killed, but's pride had bled worse than any wound. The judge had placed a bounty on that followed him across 3 territories before time and distance dissolved it into rumor. Getting tangled with a woman considered his property would resurrect every dormant warrant, every sleeping enemy, every ghost had spent years outrunning. Virgil did not tell him to leave. He simply presented the arithmetic of risk and let the numbers speak. Stayed. He stayed, and in staying he began to build something he did not have a name for, constructed not from words but from the slow accumulation of gestures that passed between himself and Rose like notes in a melody neither had agreed to play. He repaired the broken step outside her door at the saloon and never mentioned it. She mended a tear in his riding coat and left it folded on the porch railing, the stitches small and precise as a schoolteacher's handwriting. He taught her to shoot one afternoon behind the livery, standing close enough to adjust her grip on the revolver, close enough to catch the scent of lye soap in her hair, but he never closed the distance between instruction and intimacy. She borrowed a volume of poetry from Doc's meager shelf and read aloud in the evenings on the balcony, and listened from the alley below, leaning against the wall with his hat pulled low, pretending he was not there while memorizing every cadence of her voice. Then came the evening that changed the grammar of everything between them. Rose reached for a tin on a high shelf in Nell's storeroom, and her sleeve fell back, and the brand lay exposed in the lamplight, raw, ugly, undeniable. She froze, was standing 3 feet away. She waited for the look she had learned to expect from the world, the flinch, the pity, the quiet horror that reduced her to the mark and nothing more. He rolled up his own sleeve. On the inside of his forearm ran a scar, thick, deliberate, carved by his own hand years ago to obliterate a tattoo from the days when he belonged to men he no longer wished to remember. He held his arm beside hers. 2 damaged skins, 2 histories written in raised and ruined flesh. "We all carry what they put on us," he said, his voice low and stripped of everything but truth. "Doesn't mean it gets to say who we are." Rose looked at his scar, then at her brand, and then at his eyes. And somewhere south, in a stone house full of mounted heads and stolen deeds, Judge Solomon set down a glass of bourbon and read a letter from Marshal Thorne confirming that a branded woman and a man matching Graves' description had been seen alive in a town called Sable Creek. He folded the letter neatly, placed it in his breast pocket, and said to the empty room in a voice as quiet and certain as a closing door, "Bring her back. And bring me his hands." The morning that changed everything arrived dressed in beauty, as though the land itself had decided to offer one final kindness before the trouble came. A soft wind moved through Sable Creek carrying the scent of creosote and wild sage, and the sky was the deep, impossible blue that only exists in high desert country after a night of cool air has scrubbed the dust from the atmosphere and left nothing between the earth and heaven but clarity. Sparrows chattered in the eaves of the livery. A tabby cat stretched on the warm boards of Nell's porch, and somewhere down the street the blacksmith's hammer rang in a steady, almost musical rhythm that gave the town a pulse it did not usually possess. It was the kind of morning that made you believe things could hold, that the fragile architecture of safety and routine could bear the weight of another day. Rose stood behind the bar at the Copper Vale, drying glasses with a cloth and listening to sound out the words of a sentence she had written on a piece of brown paper. Lips moved carefully around each syllable, her brow furrowed in concentration, and when she reached the end of the line without error, she looked up with a grin so wide and so unguarded that it transformed her painted face into something closer to the girl she had been before the world made its demands. Rose smiled back, not the cautious, provisional smile she had worn during her first weeks in Sable Creek, but something warmer, something that reached her eyes and stayed there. She was not healed. Healing, she had learned, was not a destination but a direction, a road you walked without ever being entirely certain you had arrived. But she was walking it, and the walking had changed her. She held her shoulders differently now. She spoke in full sentences. She had begun to teach to read, and 2 of the farrier's children to do arithmetic, and in the act of teaching she had recovered a piece of herself she thought the desert had swallowed permanently. The knowledge that she had something to offer the world beyond the story of what had been done to her. Doc had been sober for 11 days. He sat in his cabin each morning reading a medical journal that was 2 years out of date, and his hands, though still not steady, trembled less with each passing sunrise. He credited the whiskey's absence to stubbornness, but everyone who watched him knew the truth. Rose's presence had given him someone to be sober for, a reason that existed outside the long, circular argument he had been having with himself and the bottle for the better part of a decade. watched all of it from the periphery, the way he watched everything from the shadow of a porch post, from the far end of the street, from the careful distance he maintained, not because he did not want to be closer, but because he was afraid of what closeness would reveal. He was not afraid of. He was not afraid of guns or warrants or the arithmetic of violence. He was afraid that when the trouble arrived, and he knew it would, the way you know weather by the ache in old wounds, Rose would see him as he had been and not as he was trying to become, and that the difference between those two men would not be large enough to matter. They came at midday, when the sun was directly overhead, and the shadows had retreated beneath the buildings like animals sensing a storm. 4 riders and Marshal Thorne, moving up the main street in a loose formation that spoke of confidence rather than caution, rode at the center on a black gelding, his marshal's star catching the light with each step, his face set in the particular expression of a man who has mistaken authority for righteousness so many times that he can no longer tell the difference. He carried a rolled document in his left hand and a holstered pistol on his right hip, and he sat his saddle with the theatrical straightness of someone who knows he is being watched and wants the watching to count. He stopped in front of the copper veil and called out in a voice that carried the full length of the street. He had a warrant, he said, a legal instrument signed by a territorial judge, though he did not say which judge, and the paper itself bore the kind of fresh, too perfect creases that suggested it had been written not in a courthouse, but in a stone study full of mounted heads. The warrant named one as a runaway debtor owing a considerable sum to the estate of Judge Solomon, and it demanded her immediate surrender to the custody of the marshal's office for transport back to Flats. Read this aloud with the flat satisfaction of a man delivering a sermon. He has already decided everyone will obey. The town did what towns do. Doors closed, curtains drew shut, the blacksmith's hammer stopped. A woman pulled her children off the street with the quiet urgency of someone clearing a table before a storm. The farrier looked at his boots. The preacher looked at the sky. It was the oldest story in the territory, good people choosing silence because silence was cheaper than courage, and because courage out here was a currency that could get you killed. But not every door closed. Nell stepped onto the porch of the copper veil carrying a shotgun that was older than most of the buildings on the street. She held it with the casual ease of a woman who had held many difficult things in her life, and had learned that the weight mattered less than the willingness to bear it. She looked at, and his riders the way you look at rain when you have already decided to walk through it. She is not property, Nell said. She is my employee. She washes my linens and pours my whiskey and teaches letters to the children of this town, and you are standing on my porch. Doc emerged next, blinking against the noon glare, a pistol in his hand that he had not fired in years. His grip was uncertain, but his eyes were not, and there was something in the way he positioned himself beside Nell that suggested a man who had finally found something worth the risk of steady hands. Then appeared in the saloon doorway, holding a cast-iron skillet with an expression that dared anyone to question its effectiveness as a weapon. Then Virgil, who had been sitting in the shade of the livery whittling a piece of cedar, rose to his feet with the slow, unhurried grace of a man who had already made every important decision of the day before breakfast, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver the way it rested on the arm of a chair, naturally, without thought, as though violence were simply another dialect he happened to speak, and then walked into the street. He came from the direction of the creek, and the sun was behind him, and his shadow stretched long and dark across the dust like a second self arriving ahead of him to announce what was coming. He did not draw his weapon. He stopped 10 paces from his horse and stood with his hands at his sides and looked up at the marshal with an expression that held no anger, no bravado, nothing but the terrible clarity of a man who has decided to stop running and is discovering, for the first time, what it feels like to stand. He spoke quietly. He did not raise his voice, and yet every ear on the street heard him, because there is a quality to truth spoken without performance that carries farther than any shout. He told them what Solomon had done. He told them about the advertisement with no children. He told them about the branding iron heated and waiting before Rose ever thought to run. He told them about the whip marks on her back and the ribs cracked by a man who owned more land than God and less mercy than the desert. He told them everything, and then he told them about himself, the robberies, the gang, the years of running, because he understood that the truth is only as strong as the person telling it is honest, and honesty meant all of it, not just the parts that made you look like someone worth believing. Then a voice cracked open the silence from an unexpected direction. Billy Yarrow, young, thin, trembling with the particular terror of a man about to do the first brave thing of his life, stepped forward from behind's riders. He had followed them from flats, riding a borrowed horse and drinking from a borrowed flask, and he was drunk and shaking and his eyes were red, but his voice when it came was clear enough. He had been there. He had seen the branding. He had heard Rose scream and he had done nothing, and the nothing had followed him every night since, sitting at the foot of his bed like a dog that would not leave. He confirmed everything, every word. The warrant dissolved, not literally but in every way that mattered. Riders exchanged glances, and in those glances was the silent calculation of men reassessing which side of a story they wanted to be remembered on. His face darkened. His hand moved toward his holster with the jerky, imprecise motion of a man acting on pride rather than strategy. The gunshot was singular and sharp, a sound like the world cracking its knuckle. Drew and Virgil stepped sideways, and his revolver cleared leather with a speed that belonged to the man he had been, and now served the man he was becoming. The bullet took in the shoulder and spun him sideways off his horse. He hit the ground in a cloud of dust and lay clutching his arm, the marshal's star winking stupidly in the dirt beside him. Virgil took a round in the upper arm from one of the riders and grunted, but did not fall. The remaining riders, seeing their authority bleeding in the street and the barrels of a town aimed in their direction, turned their horses and rode hard toward the horizon, carrying nothing with them but the knowledge that Sable Creek was not what they had been told. The dust settled. The silence that followed was not empty but full of breath, full of pulse, full of the particular ringing quiet that exists in the seconds after the world has shifted on its axis and has not yet decided what shape it will take next. Rose stepped out of the saloon. She had not hidden. She had not run. She stood on the porch with her branded wrist uncovered and her dark eyes clear and dry, and she looked at the street full of people who had chosen to stand rather than close their doors, and she looked at, who was breathing hard with blood on his knuckles and trailing from his hand like the ghost of the man he used to be departing for good. She walked to him. She took his hand gently with both of hers, the way you hold something that you have only just realized is precious. She did not say thank you, she said. You didn't save me. You gave me time to save myself. And he nodded because it was true, and because some truths are too large for anything but silence and the press of one hand against another. In the weeks that followed, Billy Yarrow's testimony reached a territorial judge, a real one, and an investigation into Solomon's empire of paper and cruelty began its slow, inexorable unraveling. Rose opened a school in the back room of the Copper Vale, and the children came, and then their mothers came, and then even Dalton came, not to gossip but to sit quietly in the corner and listen to a woman teach the alphabet as though each letter were a door that opened onto a room the children had not yet seen. Doc hung a shingle outside his cabin for the first time in years. Virgil's arm healed in a sling he wore with an air of distinction, as though it were a medal rather than a bandage. Nell poured whiskey, and said little and watched everything with the satisfied expression of a woman whose porch had proven to be exactly the fortress she always knew it was. Did not leave. He did not propose or declare or make promises shaped like forever. He simply stayed. He built a fence around the schoolyard with his own hands. He sat on the porch in the evenings while Rose read aloud, and sometimes their shoulders touched, and sometimes they did not, and both versions of the silence were enough. One night, without a word, she rested her head against his shoulder, and the brand on her wrist faced the open sky, uncovered, unhidden, no longer a mark of possession but a record of what she had survived, and the proof that survival, when witnessed and honored, becomes its own kind of beauty. And so I will tell you this, the way the desert wind once told it to me, and the way I am telling it to you now. We are not the marks they leave on us. We are not the names whispered behind closed doors or the brands burned into our skin by hands that mistook cruelty for dominion. We are what we do when the sun comes up and the choice is ours again, to hide or to stand, to run or to remain, to let the scar define the story, or to write a new one over it in letters so bright that the old wound becomes nothing more than the ground from which something stubborn and beautiful insisted on growing. If this world has branded you with shame, with sorrow, with someone else's idea of what you are worth, then hear me now, and hear me well. The scar is not the story. What you build around it is. And that, dear soul, is the only tale that has ever been worth the telling.